A few weeks ago, I took a long, hard look at Team 17's Worms series, specifically the ports, because, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but that's kind of my thing. One of the games I looked at is the Amiga exclusive Worms the Director's Cut, an enhanced version of the original released exclusively for the platform that Team 17 had found their initial success on.
Worms the Director's Cut, or Worms DC as it's affectionately called by no one, isn't technically speaking a port, being as it is a shiny, spangly enhancement of a game released on a platform it was originally developed for, but not including it in the Worms special made the episode feel somehow incomplete.
Plus, it's my show, so I can basically do what I want. So now, I'm going to spend a bit of time going into more detail about this forgotten piece of gaming history, not just because it was released for a computer that I grew up playing games on, and not just because Worms is one of my favourite games of all time, but because Worms DC is genuinely noteworthy.
This is despite the fact that almost nobody knows this game even exists, which might have something to do with the fact that it only sold about 5,000 copies worldwide, which is the kind of thing that happens when you put a game out on a platform that the industry had already declared dead 4 years prior, or it might have something to do with the fact that it came out a few months behind schedule with virtually no marketing to push it to the handful of people who might have actually bought it.
But then by this point, maybe Team 17's star in the Amiga world was waning anyway. Their previous game, the abysmally titled Alien Breed 3D 2 The Killing Grounds, was an absolute disaster, and chances are if you'd forked over your hard-earned cash for a copy of that game, you wouldn't have bought their next title irregardless of what it was. It could have been a single floppy disk labelled, put this in your disk drive and mash the spacebar for instant guilt-free orgasms, and you still wouldn't have bought it. That's how bad The Killing Grounds was.
This is, by and large, an updated version of the original Worms with new weapons, new options and new features, but that's just scratching the surface. Underneath, the game has been given a rather significant overhaul. Worms DC only runs on Amiga systems with an AGA chipset, which was only included in 4 models of Amiga, all released between 1992 and 1994, and none of which had done particularly well commercially compared with the earlier Amiga 500. But by taking advantage of this chipset, Worms DC was able to significantly up the quality of the visuals in the game, upping the number of colours on screen from 64 to 256.
There's a heavy emphasis on customization in Worms DC. Some of these customization tweaks are fairly small. For instance, teams are saved as individual files rather than being lumped into one team repository, which not only means you can delete teams from within the operating system, but it also means you can copy your team file to a floppy disk and take it round a mate's house. But there are also bigger changes in terms of customization. For instance, you can add a background layer to custom maps, you can create your own mountain sets, but perhaps most crucially, you can actually create your own terrains for random landscape generation.
Worms DC comes bundled with a little tool called WormPress, which lets you do all of this stuff, but it's the custom terrain style feature which is the biggest selling point. Anybody who's played Worms is probably used to playing on the Arctic or forest terrains, but using WormPress you can add your own terrains to Worms the Director's Cut. Want to make a terrain inspired by your favourite TV show? Yeah, go for it. Want to spend hours converting terrain from Worms Armageddon for use in Worms the Director's Cut? Sure, why the hell not? The possibilities are endless.
Well, I'd say endless, but custom terrain styles and maps are limited to a colour palette of just 16 colours, what with all the other colours being used for things like the sky gradient, the HUD, the sprites, the water, the scrolling parallax backgrounds. But it's something, and there is, or rather was, a dedicated community pumping out all manner of different styles of terrain.
There's also the graffiti mode, which allows you to draw your own maps using the mouse and then play on them instantly. As you can see, I've chosen to use this feature to draw a massive cock. Aren't I clever?
But Ben, I hear you say, most of the features you're talking about are standard in the newer versions of the game, so how on IO is this even noteworthy? And to that I say, never, ever question me again! But I think it's safe to say that without the experimentation and risk-taking during the development of Worms the Director's Cut, most of the features that people love about the newer games like Worms Armageddon and Worms Reloaded wouldn't even exist.
When Worms 2, the first proper follow-up to the original, went into development, Team 17 had just intended it to be a bigger, fancier, prettier version of the original and didn't plan on adding much in the way of new features and content. So Worms creator Andy Davidson, seen here surrounded by friends and family, took it upon himself to experiment with ways in which the game could be improved upon. And the customization wasn't the only innovation he added to the game.
Think of the iconic weapons you associate with the Worms series. The Super Sheep, the Holy Hand Grenade, the Mad Cow, the Old Woman, all of these weapons made their debut in Worms DC, and none of these weapons would exist at all if it hadn't been for Andy Davidson sticking his finger up at the man, whoever the man may have been at the time, and saying, "We can make this game better."
And he did. Worms DC features almost 20 new weapons compared to the original, almost all of which went into Worms 2. One of the weapons, the grenade launcher, was retooled into the mortar for Worms 2, another, the sheep on a rope, never made the jump, making Worms DC the only game in the entire series where the weapon can be used.
Not only that, but these new weapons convinced Team 17 that actually maybe adding new weapons to a new Worms game isn't necessarily such a bad idea, and every new Worms game that's come out since has had a handful of new and occasionally exclusive weapons.
The game does sadly feature more than its fair share of game-breaking bugs, some of which were fixed with a patch disc that didn't see a general release, but did eventually find its way onto the internet.
And the good news is that you can download that patch disc and in fact the entire game legally and for free from an authorized Team 17 fan site called Dream 17, which, full disclosure, I founded myself back in 2003. There's a link in the description for you. Now, you will also need an Amiga emulator, which requires the use of a Kickstart ROM, which unfortunately can't be downloaded for free. Not legally anyway. So that's it, I'm done. I finally got Worms out of my system. That's it. That's the joke that I'm ending on this week. That's the whole thing.